Welcome to this third video on Catholic social teaching. In this video, I'd like to talk about rights in Catholic social teaching. I have spoken in other videos about the obligations of people and societies, but the other side of obligations and duties is that people have rights that must be respected. Now, we might be used to hearing the word rights thrown around, and it is a word that is frequently used, abused, and misused. What do rights mean in Catholic social teaching? I think we can clarify things by saying that a right is simply a prerequisite for dignified living in a community. A right is a prerequisite for dignified living in a community. So, from a secular perspective, a right is a condition necessary for decent living in society. In a Christian context, though, these rights take on a special dimension because we hold that all people are created in the image and likeness of God. So each one of us has an intrinsic dignity and personal value. That's very important. And I talk about this in my video on Christian anthropology. I talk about it in my video on the Catholic intellectual tradition. These are all rooted in the idea that all of us have an intrinsic dignity and value that comes from being made in the image and likeness of God. And so, an important aspect of this teaching is that human rights are not created or granted by society. They are God-given rights. Society's duty is not to grant rights, but rather to uphold and protect these rights. In a previous video, I spoke about the Tiananmen Square massacre and the challenge to the Chinese leader that this was a violation of human rights. And the leader said, well, the state has not yet given these rights to the students. Compare that perspective with the perspective of Catholic social teaching and the philosophy behind the United States Declaration of Independence. The Declaration says this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Importantly, the genius of the founding fathers of the United States is that all people are created equal and their rights come not from the state, but from their Creator. That is, human rights are there by virtue of our being human, not by virtue of being granted by a state, a sovereign, or some other body. So that's rights in the abstract. What are rights in the concrete? Human rights are the minimum conditions for dignified living in community. So let's start with the necessary conditions of life. There are, first of all, for example, the right to life itself. You cannot live a dignified life if you're deprived of life. There are necessary conditions for life such as food, clothing, shelter, rest, and medical care. But there are also rights to ensure the dignified state of life, and I'd like you to bear that in mind. Rights are not just about life, but they're about dignified life in community. And so these rights include basic education and the right to earn a decent living. Now, of special note here is that for most of us, the right to earn a dignified living comes from employment, but for those who can't, there's the right to basic social security. But within employment, there's the right to healthy working conditions and to wages or benefits sufficient to provide individuals and families with a reasonable standard of living. That is, a standard of living that's in accord with their basic human dignity. Now, these human rights also presuppose certain civil and political rights. Freedom of worship, for example, implies a social respect for the dignity of people as religious persons. Freedom of speech allows for the political dignity and freedom from interference by either other persons or by governments. In most democracies such as Australia or the United States, these rights are recognised by the constitutional right to vote for government. But I'll note something important here because Catholic social teaching is often misunderstood. The Church doesn't teach that a particular form of democracy is the only way or even the preferred way. Certainly democracy is an acceptable and rather good way of achieving those rights. But the Church, as I've said previously, doesn't provide technical solutions. It only takes particular social institutions and asks, do these institutions uphold and foster the dignity of human persons and their rights or not? So I'd like you to bear that point in mind.